So, good evening, everybody, and a very good morning to Amitav, who's joining us with his morning cup of coffee from Brooklyn. Thank you so much for making time for us on a Sunday morning for this very special Zoom session. It's our first Zoom session at the Tata Steel Kolkata Literary Meet, and the topic is something very fresh on all our minds. And those who have gone through it will never forget it. And though you were at a distance, you were one of the first people to tell many of your friends in Kolkata about it. So thank you, Amitav, for coming on this Zoom webinar. I hope you can see me well.
Yes, I can see you very well. And thank you very much for inviting me. It's such a pleasure to be with you and to be with all the attendees. So thank you.
Okay. So as I said, it was an afternoon. Very few of us in Bengal and in Kolkata, where I'm speaking from will ever forget. And let me quote to you from your book. Who can forget those moments when something that seems inanimate turns out to be vitally, even dangerously alive? So all those who saw those trees swaying like palm fronds will never forget how nature suddenly came alive in a malign way almost. So before we reach that, the stories of that afternoon of the 20th of May, when did you first hear about Amphan, and what made you reach out to all your friends in Kolkata and warn them that they are in harm's way?
Well, I heard about it first. Actually, who was it? I saw something on Twitter. And then I wrote to my friend Adam Sobel, who's a climate scientist at Columbia University, and he's a specialist on cyclones and has actually worked on cyclones in the Bay of Bengal. And then, at first, of course, one doesn't want to overreact straight away. So, at first, I just watched and waited. Whilst Amphan was just, smaller than a fist, at the bottom.
When was this?
Let's see. I think it was about last Friday or something. Thursday or Friday, something like that. I'm not absolutely sure about the dates. But then Adam sent me a note where I could see that he was sounding concerned. Even though he was very careful to be neutral in his tone and so on, because again, people don't like to overreact. But then I finally, I started speaking to my sister, who's in Calcutta, with my bedridden mother and my niece. So I started writing to her, I think about Friday, and I started warning her. And then I thought I should warn my friends as well. So I wrote to all of you. I sent you what Adam had written to me. The strange thing is that some people took it seriously, and some people actually scoffed. It's so strange that people would actually scoff at a moment like that.
And yes, so you were quite clear that this was something serious. I won't say I scoffed, but typically I thought, it'll weaken as many storms have in the past. So, yes, so did you expect it to be this ferocious?
Honestly, one doesn't know. Because really with Funny as well, I was extremely concerned. But Funny veered, and that often happens with cyclones. I mean, they swerve, they veer, they move away. And I think one of the reasons why people in Kolkata were so lackadaisical, about this one, is because they thought it would veer. There's a kind of mentality in Kolkata where people think, oh, cyclones, they'll hit Odisha or they'll hit Bangladesh, we always get saved somehow. And, there's really no reason for that kind of complacency, And with this one, yeah, it did weaken. It weakened considerably. By the time it hit Kolkata, I think wind speeds were like in the 120s, 120 kmph. Whereas when it hit the coastline, it was in the 180s. So yes, it certainly weakened a great deal.
Okay. So I'm sure you've heard enough about it from your family and from, those who spoke to you. Were you awake that day when landfall happened? And, it must have been very early in the morning in your part of the world.
Absolutely, absolutely. I was talking to my sister through the whole thing right from the beginning. See, I was almost continuously on the phone with my sister for the days before that, because I took her through, because she again didn't really understand what was coming at her. And especially since my mother is bedridden and she has various respiratory diseases, ailments and so on. I was very, very worried because, we're in the middle of this COVID crisis. If something bad happens, I'm completely helpless. I can't go there. So I, in great detail, took her through every single preparation. I took her through how the windows were to be tied, how the doors were to be tied, how everything was to be secured, how, especially on the ground floor, how things were to be removed, how, what things should be unplugged. And I think, later she tells me, I mean, after it was over, she told me, all of that really, really saved them and really helped them. So, I think the moral of that story is really prepare, prepare, prepare. you
Yes.
know when you see something coming at you like this, especially if you're someone who has some information on these matters, if you don't prepare, and
Yes.
if you don't warn your friends and your loved ones,
Yes.
you're culpable, you're criminally culpable. You have
Yes.
to warn them.
Yes. In fact, somebody has just messaged that, Yvonne Miller has asked you, how do you rate the kind of preparedness that was there before the Amphan hit? With the sophisticated warning systems we have now, do you think it was quite amazing that every life is important, but we still have a toll of under 100 considering the storm?
See, the Indian Meteorological Department did an amazing job. You know, they really tracked the hurricane, the cyclone very, very well. They forecast its path very, very well. They tried to warn people way ahead. But what was really shocking to me is that at a time when I knew that it was coming towards Calcutta, the newspapers in Calcutta didn't seem to know or care. They were not putting out the word, they were not warning people to make preparations. So I don't think it's a fault of any governmental agency, it's really a fault of the media. I mean, even the my sister told me that she finally saw it in the media the day before the cyclone actually struck. Which I think is just shocking, actually. What were they doing? Why weren't they warning people? I just don't understand it. You know, on the whole, we were very fortunate. This could have been much, much, much worse. We were fortunate that it weakened so considerably. I mean, this was at one stage a category 5. You know, you saw what I mean. You went through it. You know what you went through. But
Yes.
if you think, the difference between a category 2 and a category 5 is not a difference of degree. They're exponentially worse. Category 5 is not twice or a little more than that worse than a category 2. It's much, much, much worse. So in that sense, what you went through, you have to consider yourself lucky in a way. I mean,
Yes.
I know I spoke to you the day after, and I could see how shaken you were. I spoke to my sister. I could tell that she was in shock. You know, but these are. You were lucky. That's all I can say. Is that you were lucky in multiple ways.
So, you've mentioned that the media was I mean, they didn't mention it, and one can't guess why, but I guess everyone's been so caught up with the COVID coverage that they just may have taken their eye off this one. The other great sorrow for many Calcuttans and those in Bengal and Odisha is that it's not been covered subsequently as well. there has been very little coverage in the national media about Amphan, which again is rather unfortunate, because as you said, we were all terribly shaken. There is loss of life, there's huge loss of property, and much else that we'll discuss. So what do you attribute this apathy to? Once the event has happened, any news person worth his salt should have covered it.
What can I say? I've been saying for years that our media, our national media, is just we've become enmeshed in a kind of tamasha culture. They're just much more I mean, I think if a Bollywood star had sneezed, that would have made a bigger news than Cyclone Amphan. I mean, what can one say? It's beneath contempt, really. And that's why one has to develop these other networks, for sharing news, for sharing attention, because it's increasingly clear that a large part of the Indian media are just what can I say, beyond redemption.
Beyond redemption, indeed. The good news is that we had a lot of public announcements on the streets, which was possibly organized by KMC and the government, telling people from the day before that this was coming and they should be careful. The lockdown too proved to be an ally at that time, I would say, because it's highly unlikely that the roads of Calcutta would have been that empty on a Wednesday afternoon, but for the storm. So, one of the people attending this webinar has asked Samrita about how this ties back to your concerns about climate change. Do you think the storm, the heat, the global warming had anything to do with the force of the storm when it made its landfall?
See, global warming is not the cause of the storm as such, of course. But what we know is that it's always in the background. It intensifies storms like this.
How does that happen?
Well, in several ways. One is, of course, storms. Tropical storms draw their energy from surface water surface temperatures, and the temperatures are exceptionally warm. I mean, the oceans don't warm evenly. Some parts warm faster than others, and both the Bay of Bengal and the Arabian Sea are warming at record rates. You know, so it makes sense that all that excess energy will translate in some way into storms. The other thing that has happened with global warming is that the air, uh, because it's warmer, holds more moisture. So when rainfall happens, it dumps more and more rain, which is why we've been seeing all these rain bomb events. Bombay has been hit several times by rain bomb events. So yes, there's a clear. I mean, I'm not a scientist. I can't say, but I follow what scientists are saying. I follow their work. Michael Mann, who's one of the leading climate scientists in the world, has published several papers showing, you know, writing about the intensification of storms because of Kerry Emanuel, who's the great authority on this, and who was actually Adam Sobel's teacher at MIT, has also published on this subject. So there's really no doubt. I mean, global warming is going to intensify cyclones. Whether there are going to be more cyclones or hurricanes because of global warming, we don't know for sure, because there are contrary sorts of indications. But this year in the US, for example, they're expecting an exceptionally busy hurricane season. So, some James Hansen, one of the great climate scientists, he, along with some collaborators, published a major paper some years ago showing, arguing that we are heading for superstorm events, I mean, storm events on a scale that completely dwarf what we've already seen. So we have to prepare, we have to prepare for the future.
You mentioned that the frequency could increase, and the funny took place, I think, around the 24th or 25th of April last year. Sometime in November or thereabouts, we had Bulbul, and in May, we have Amphan. So that's three fairly serious climate incidents in a very short period. So would you say, is this normal, or do you think there has been more activity than normal over the Bay of Bengal?
Well, I can't extrapolate from the data because I'm not absolutely sure. But one thing that climate scientists do predict is that the Bay of Bengal has within our historical memory over the last 200-300 years been a huge storm breeder. I mean, it's generated a huge, very large number of storms. But there is some indication that, and climate scientists predict that in fact, some of this activity is now moving to the Arabian Sea. It's actually the Arabian Sea that has seen a huge increase in the number of storms, going back to 1998 onwards. And because we have a history on the East Coast of being hit by storms, we also have, over the last 20 years, put in place a lot of mechanisms for coping with these storms. So evacuation procedures, for example, I mean, Odisha has become like a world leader.
Yes, they have really set up a template.
Yes, they really have. I mean, kudos to them, and especially to Naveen Patnaik, who's been really quite remarkable at dealing with these things. But on the West Coast, they're going to get hit. They have been hit, several times over the last 20 years, but they don't have these preparations in place. That's what really worries me. Bad as this was, Kolkata, after all, is 100 kilometers inland. So this storm had to travel across the Sundarban. It had to travel across, a lot of land.
Yes.
Imagine if this storm were to come at Mumbai. Just imagine. Mumbai is completely exposed, absolutely exposed. It's just sitting directly upon the ocean. And, directly upon the ocean are these massive buildings. You saw how the buildings shook, in Kolkata. You
Yes,
saw
they have
how many.
earned some praise for shaking, but a lot of criticism for the French windows and fiber glass, which could have been projectiles at that wind velocity.
It's crazy. It's absolutely crazy. I mean, they put in this glass, and it's not reinforced glass. It's not reinforced glass. I mean, it's just absolutely fragile glass. So, fortunately, in my home in Kolkata, we actually have the old-fashioned wooden shutters. Our ancestors had much more sense than we do. So they had put in these wooden shutters, so we just had to tie the wooden shutters together, to protect the window panes. But, the first thing I said to many, many friends was that, tell your families to stay away from the glass windows. And I know, of people whose windows shattered, and, there was
Yes.
glass flying around their houses.
Yes. We saw
It's
one
just.
such house. A window just flew off its hinges because it just was flapping. It wasn't a French window, it was a tiny little window, but that was the force of the wind. Now, before we come back to Calcutta and what we can do for urban planning, Sunderbans, you just mentioned, it's always it takes the first hit. So compare this to Isla, and what do you think the preparedness this time is? Have you got word from your friends there?
Yes, I have heard from people, and I've been trying to follow it to the best of my ability. Look, Aila was a much weaker storm than this one. As we all know, this storm was much more powerful than Aila. And Aila, again, simply because we have all these good, now these preparatory measures, Aila again didn't take a huge toll in terms of lives. But the problem really is that Aila's long-term effects were devastating for the Sundarban. Because already they've been suffering from this from a problem of saltwater intrusion,
Yes.
and on top of that, now you've had this wall of salt water coming in. I did an interview with the Times of India before Amphan hit, actually, and I said these are the problems of the Sundarban, that the embankments will be breached, there'll be huge saltwater inundations, freshwater ponds and all sources of fresh water will be contaminated with salt water. And that's actually exactly what has happened. I mean, it'll be years before any kind of agriculture can resume in the Sundarban.
Yes. Devjani Bhattacharya has asked, concrete embankments built post Ayla were breached. Do you think we need to rethink the way we construct embankments?
Look, embankments in the end don't really work. I mean, we've seen that in the US as well. I mean, in New Orleans, I mean, here in the US, enormous amounts of money and enormous amounts of work into, building up their system of levees, as they call them here. But they're regularly breached when there's a major storm. You know, after Katrina, they were, for example, heavily breached. They result actually often in worsening the inundations. Look, I hate to say this, but in the long run, the only possible strategy for the Sundarban is some kind of, for the people of the Sundarban is some kind of managed retreat. And I know that our government probably is not capable of putting in such a process. But I do know, I do hear from friends, especially from, the great Sundarban researcher Anu Jale, who now teaches actually at the National University of
Singapore.
Singapore. She keeps me informed, about the developments there very often. And she's been telling me for years now that many of the people she knows have actually been doing their own managed retreat. All of them have acquired little bits of land or something, somewhere in the interior, so that when these things threaten, they can also withdraw. And I think, it points to their good sense. I think they understand that, in the long run, these areas are perhaps not defensible because this is just beginning, and they're going to get more and more of these inundations. People who live close to the land understand these things better, perhaps, than certainly better than many scientists or forecasters do.
Okay. So staying with the Sundarbans, in your literary history, your own personal literary history, you spoke about the Hungry Tide has this climactic scene where there's this massive storm with Fokir and Pia caught in it. So you've always said that we don't have real climate incidents ever as part of literature anymore, in the way Bibhuti Bhushan had it in Amati Bhepu and so on and so forth. So do you think your works will have place for Amphan in the future, or do you think Bengali writers will take a inspiration from these strange times where we have an epidemic and then a storm to start off a literary journey that does doff its hat to climate change?
Well, actually, Bengali literature historically has been very responsive to environmental um, issues simply because we live in such a difficult environment in a way. Bengal is a difficult, environmentally not a very
Terrain,
stable
tough
place.
terrain.
Yeah, it's tough terrain. I mean, we have these terrible monsoon inundations, etc. And historically, Bengali literature has been very responsive to this. If we think of Advaita Mollu Bormon, or, I often think actually of Pather Panchali. And really, all of it, the whole narrative arc of Pather Panchali hinges upon that storm. He works it in so beautifully into the narrative of the movie. It's profoundly moving and incredibly powerful. I think, you know of all the storm depictions that I've seen, uh, it's perhaps the finest and most powerful. So, and of course it comes from Vibhuti Bhushan's book. So in the past, we certainly had this. We had a kind of a responsiveness to these events. And if you go back further, even, if you think of the Mongol Kabbos, the Bengali Mongol Kabbos are full of events like this. I mean, Monasha Devi, for example, is also in some way the goddess of storms. I mean, she cooks up storms, to torment Chand Saudagar. And in fact, you know, it really it
That's,
really
that's
struck.
Gun Island territory, basically.
Yes, it's Gun Island territory, absolutely. So it's really remarkable. Our Mongol couples are full of depictions of events like this. It's only really in this period of neoliberalism, of the last 30 years, that people have forgotten, uh, 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 about the world around us. It's it's one of the many disasters that really this neoliberal world has imposed upon us.
Okay. Somebody has asked whether disaster management should be taught as a course in colleges as a specialized form of, a discipline by itself.
I think it should be, but I think it should be integrated into a wider course of studies, rather than just teaching disaster as a just as a form of management as such. You know, Actually, around the world over the last 7 8 years, what I've seen is a huge explosion in what's called the environmental humanities. For example, in Singapore, all three major universities in Singapore have courses in the environmental humanities. In Sweden, there are courses across Europe. In America, it's just a field that's exploding. But in India, there's been no such response. You know, Indian institutions of education have been very slow to respond, to the world that we're in. So I think disaster management should be taught, but it should be integrated into a broader field of studies where people start paying attention,
Yeah.
to not just the management aspect of disasters, but also what lies behind it: climate change, the things that are driving it, uh, the modes of consumption and production that are actually driving this crisis.
Okay. We have received a question about the Sundarbans again, whether, the challenge of resettling the people, the population of Sundarban for permanent resettlement. Has the time come for that?
Look,
That's a
I would
big call.
I would be very hesitant to endorse any kind of governmental evacuation process, because we know how violent that will be, how violent and repressive that will be. We know it from Murid Jhampi, I mean,
Yes, of
that
course.
was a kind of resettlement process. And we saw how incredibly violent and murderous it became. So I would certainly not want to advocate any kind of governmental intervention there. But
Right.
again, what we have seen is that this withdrawal is actually taking place already. I mean, I spend a lot of time in Goa, for example, and over the last 10 years, actually over the last 15 years, what's happened in Goa is very similar to what's happened in Brooklyn. When I open the
Lots of
window,
Bengalis, you mean?
I hear Bangla on the street, and not not standard Bangla, but dialectal Bangla, being spoken on the street going past me. That happens in Brooklyn. That happens in the small village that I'm where I live when I'm in India, in Goa. In
Mm.
the evenings in Goa, you see large numbers of Bengalis, gathering in the village center. The only restaurant in the village that I'm in Goa is run by Bengalis, and most of them are actually from the Sundarban region. From the area between Kolkata and Canning. you know, that's where a lot of them are from.
Okay. Now, there are several questions, several and many from people you know. So let me take one such from Pradeep Kakkar. So he wanted you to comment on the preparedness which is required in an urban center like Kolkata. What can we do to face nature's fury when it comes? Because now we do have warning systems. So what are your suggestions for the future?
Well, Pradeep and Bonani run Public, which is an NGO which has been working across Kolkata for a long time, especially on environmental issues. They've mapped all the trees and all the water bodies of Kolkata. And in fact, I think the most important thing the government can do in terms of preparedness is to consult with NGOs. NGOs like Public, and other environmental groups that have been active in Kolkata for a long time. One thing going ahead, I think we should really pay attention to is the placement of trees. Especially in relation to the power supply and to other cables. One of the most important things we can do is to try and place cables underground as far as possible. To try and move utilities, all kinds of utilities underground. That's a very important thing to do, I think. But it's a very major investment, a very major, you know, undertaking. But yeah, I do think that preparedness is very important going ahead. Also, there should be more evacuation procedures, more planning for evacuation. Especially in Kolkata, where again there are a lot of people living on the streets, where there are a lot of migrant workers. There should be more provision for them.
Okay. Now, coming back to your writing, we just received a question from Sudeshna Chakravorty. Why did Fokir die? So, that is a question that we just mentioned. Every life. Do you think this vulnerability? Let's link it back to the current situation. So, do you think that there's always this myth among urban folk that people in Sundarbans know that a storm is coming and they will find they're more secure than us urban people who have no link to nature? Do you think that's an unfair assumption and they are really the most vulnerable people living right at the forefront when there's a landfall?
They are certainly the most vulnerable people, and Anuj Relate tells me that one of the ways in which people in the Sundarban prepare for cyclones is, just before the cyclone comes, they'll kill their chickens and eat it, and they'll take the big fish out of their ponds and cook them and eat them, so that they don't get wasted. And they know that in the wake of the cyclone, they're going to starve, for a while. So they certainly are aware of the destructive power of cyclones. But again, they're extremely vulnerable. They're right in the way of these terrible storms. There are very few cyclone shelters in West Bengal. This is where Bangladesh has done much, much better than West Bengal. Bangladesh generally has done much better than India in many things, but especially in disaster preparedness, they've certainly done much better. Their cyclone evacuation procedures and their cyclone shelters are really exemplary.
You mentioned the trees, Amitav. Do you think trees are also tangible heritage? Because you must have heard about the banyan tree at the botanical gardens. We all felt terribly anguished, rightfully, when the Notre Dame fire took place. But should we have equal amounts of anguish for the kind of loss of 100-year-old trees around the lakes, Robindra Sarovar, and indeed, as I mentioned, the trees of the botanical gardens, including the fabled banyan?
Absolutely, we should. I mean, these trees are absolutely a part of Kolkata's heritage. I mean, the Kolkata Botanical Gardens have an amazing history, going back to the 18th century. You know, uh, the one thing I would say about the great banyan of the Botanical Gardens is that it lived through the storm of 1737. You know, that was a much, much worse storm than the one we had now. They didn't have instruments for measuring storm intensities at that time, but they did measure the storm surge. The storm surge that actually came ashore in Kolkata in 1737 was 40 feet. You know, here at the worst, the storm surge was only 30 feet, and that was only at the coasts. Another way in which Kolkata and Bengal has been incredibly lucky is that this storm hit at low tide. If it had hit at high tide, as happened with, say, Sandy, it would have been a disaster beyond imagining. I mean, the flooding would have been much, much worse. So, in many ways, I think we've been lucky. But the Great Banyan has survived many things. Those are
It's
like mountains.
partially damaged. It's a
Yeah.
forest in itself. I'm sure it'll regenerate.
Absolutely.
Bachi Karkaria has joined us from Bombay. She is adequately frightened by your dire predictions for her city, but she has asked whether this is the time for us all, if not now, then when, about the Amphan as well as the COVID. Should we be more mindful now at last for about the way we live?
Of course. And hello, Bachi. Look, I've been trying for years to get people in Mumbai to pay attention to the risks. I mean, going back to the Great Derangement, and actually, one of the good things that's come out of writing the Great Derangement is that groups have started working on Mumbai storm threats. Adam Sobel, for example, has done a study. He's been there. He's led groups and worked with various groups. But he tells me that in fact, preparedness for a major storm in Mumbai is just isn't there. I mean, he spoke to disaster management officials there, and they basically said that their only form of preparedness for cyclones is telling fishermen not to go out to sea. But that's not what we need. Mumbai is just a disaster waiting to happen. Because see, Chennai, Kolkata, they have huge hinterlands, where people can move to when a storm is coming. You know, but Mumbai is just a tiny peninsula. It's a man-made peninsula. There were 6 islands, and they're connected to the mainland through. There are 2 arterial roads that connect Mumbai to the mainland. In the event of a storm, how will you evacuate Mumbai? Especially uh, if there's a, if there's a uh, you know if, you know if you have a storm surge coming towards Mumbai, how will you get people out? you know we've seen, say, with this COVID crisis, getting migrant workers out of Mumbai was so difficult. you know uh, it's just I mean, the possibilities are just horrifying. Last year, the Godrej group asked me to speak at their annual meeting. They have a sort of internal annual meeting, and for that, I was wondering, how can I get, the Godreges are huge real estate developers and so on. They're one of the largest real estate firms in the country. So I thought, how do I get them to pay attention, to the threats? And so, what I did was I wrote a short story, and I made a kind of video to accompany that short story about a storm hitting Mumbai. And I had characters and everything, and it was, so I showed this thing, and I read my story, and it did make an impact. Afterwards, Firoza Godrej, who's an old friend, said to me, "I am going to work on this." So really, Bachi, if there's anything that you can do to bring people's attention to disaster preparedness in terms of cyclone in Mumbai, please do it. It's really, really necessary to be prepared.
Okay, now we have a question from Siddhartha Banerjee, which I too had intended to ask, which is, how does the storm compare to Bhola in 1970, which was absolutely devastating and where lakhs of people died in Bangladesh, which was then East Pakistan, and in fact was one of the triggers for what then became Bangladesh.
Yeah, the Bhola storm was a historic storm. I mean, it was the worst natural disaster of the 20th century. We know for sure that at least 500,000 people died, but people say that actually it was more like 1 million that were directly killed by the storm. At that point, we didn't have these preparedness mechanisms. We didn't have this, the technology for forecasting storms with any accuracy. So it was a disaster on an epic scale, and it wasn't just Bangladesh. It devastated also the Indian Sundarban. In fact, in my last book, the Gun Island, there's a long description of what happens in Bhola to one of the main characters. It's in fact where the book almost begins, you might say. So the Bhola storm was absolutely historic, and Pakistan's, Bangladesh was then East Pakistan, and Pakistan's, callous response to Bhola was one of the reasons why the Bangladesh freedom movement began in 1970 and went through to 1971. So Bhola was one of those natural events that actually directly intervened in human history in a in an absolutely apparent way. We can see its after effects.
Okay, Johor Shorkar has asked, the mangroves mangled by the storms grow again and regenerate with time. Do you think that's going to be happening this time as well, or are the storms coming too frequently?
The mangroves, they've evolved for these situations. Mangroves, they basically grow in tropical waters, and where there are, mangroves in Florida, mangroves in the Caribbean, mangroves in Bengal, and all along the east and west coasts. They've evolved to deal with this. So mangroves are extremely resilient. A mangrove forest can completely regenerate, within a decade or 15 years. So, we can't. I think mangroves will regenerate. They will take care of themselves. We are just very fortunate to have these mangroves where they are. Uh, I mean, if there's any further human interference in the Sundarban, we should just know that storms like this will be even more devastating, much more devastating. So my plea to Bengal and really to all the government officials and elected officials and so on is, don't don't mess with the Sundarban. Let it take care of itself. It's our protection. It's a protection of the interior. It's our first line of defense. Leave them alone. You know, uh, don't try and create big tourist facilities, and don't try and put any industrial plants and stuff over there. I mean, can you imagine what would have happened if there had been, say, for example, a coal-fired power plant in the way of this storm, as there now is in Bangladesh? We just have to learn to, leave the Sundarban alone.
Okay, so I'll just ask you two questions together. Anita has asked how consumption ties into, is it the root cause for all this that the planet is going through, from Australian forest fires, which are raging at present, to, storms like Amphan? So that's one question. And Lynn Cabrera has asked, how can the average citizen take action? I live in Houston and we have family in Kolkata. Consumption first.
A consumption, yes. Well, look, obviously there is not a direct causal link, between consumption and something like Cyclone Amphan. But what is the case is that in the last 30 years, and we have to remember that it's all the greenhouse gases that are in the atmosphere right now, half were put there since this period of what's often called liberalization. We might also call it the period of neoliberalism that starts in about 1989, 1990. In these last 30 years, the world has seen an acceleration of production, of consumption, of the circulation of goods on a scale that has never existed before. I mean, it's just unbelievable, and it's been constantly increasing, this acceleration, until it was stopped dead in its tracks by COVID, by the COVID pandemic. So there is, of course, a sort of these phenomena are not causally related, but they're cognate, in the sense that they're all caused ultimately by this incredible acceleration that we see in the world of consumption, of production, of distribution. So, I mean, we know, for example, that the pandemic, how did it spread so incredibly fast? I mean, it's simply because our travel has accelerated, communications have accelerated to this point. I mean, there were outbreaks of influenza and so on in China in the 1950s that that never went beyond China, simply because it was not then connected in this way to the rest of the world. But epidemics are very closely connected to communications. I mean, cholera went out of the Bengal Delta in the late, we don't know exactly when, but probably in the late 18th century. By the 19th century, there were cholera epidemics everywhere. So yeah, it's absolutely. I mean, this I just read a very interesting article earlier today that says basically if you want to defend yourself against COVID, just stay away from capitalism.
Okay, that's one. The other question was about what can one do, because somebody has family here, and she says she's also has faced Hurricane Harvey. Lynn Cabrera.
Yeah. See, Harvey is a very good example. Hurricane Harvey hit Houston, and it was a very strange storm. It wasn't a particularly intense storm in terms of categories, but it just sat over Houston for day after day, just dumping rain on a scale unheard of. So Houston is a very good example. Houston is the fourth largest city in America. It's one of the richest cities in the world. It's the hub of the global petroleum industry. So there's a kind of mysterious irony to this. I mean, Houston is responsible for a lot of the greenhouse gases that are in the atmosphere. And then it gets hit by this absolutely devastating storm. Again, one of the reasons so badly is Houston interfered with its terrain in a catastrophic way. It's built upon a floodplain. It's blocked many of the drainage channels. Many suburbs are built upon low-lying areas. So Houston has really done what Chennai has done and what Kolkata has done. Blocked drainage channels and so on. So I think Houston is truly a warning to the world, because I think what we are seeing is that those parts of the world that have interfered with their terrain most extensively are those that are being hit the worst.
Okay, someone has commented that this talk gooses his fear or her fear that we are headed for the post-apocalyptic ecology that J.G. Ballard described in The Drowned World. So Kajal Basu has been scared by our dire predictions. So we will, J.G. Ballard brings us back to the author avatar of Amitav Ghosh. So your book is on course, I hope. Is it going to be as punctual as Amphan was? You had said June.
Well, I'm working on it, and I must say, in a way, this whole pandemic and social distancing and so on, it's, I mean, horrific as it is in so many ways, because of all the suffering that it's inflicted on people across the world. It's also given one, that sense of deep isolation, that writers often need. So that's been good. But I think it's interesting, this J.G. Ballard, because J.G. Ballard's book is fascinating. It was written in the 1940s or 50s, as I remember, and it envisages a city like New York being drowned by sea level rise. But what's really interesting about that book, is that it envisages the people who survive as kind of like colonial officials. They're full of sang-froid. They meet for tea, and so he sees it in the 19th century light. And I think that's really what's interesting, about a lot of the fiction that's written about climate change. In fact, a lot of it is projections, the projections from the past that come disguised as. Now, we know now that there's no sang-froid in the world, especially amongst officials. I mean, officials in Britain and officials in America are, they're completely lacking in any kind of calm or sort of like colonial era sense of stiff upper lip. I mean, that's all gone, and that's one of the effects, in fact, of this of what I call the Great Derangement.
Okay, and so sticking with Junglenama, I thought I'd ask you if Bon Bibi's the epic, which you so beautifully translated, that poem at the end of Hungry Tide, if that were to be written today, would the tiger be a tidal storm? Is that the biggest danger that now confronts the waterfront of Bengal rather than the tiger?
Well, I should explain that
Actually a form of nature's fury.
I should explain that Junglenama is a book that I actually finished at the beginning of this COVID pandemic. in early March. I finished it. It's an adaptation of the Bonbibi legend. You know, the Bonbibi legend is the legend of the Sundarban of Bonbibi, who's like the goddess of the, or let's say the being of the forest. So I've adapted one part. I think the most important part of the legend, which is about a boy called Dukhe and Dukhin Rai, who's the tiger demon. So I've adapted that in verse actually, and in verse that it's English, so but it's written in Dwipodi Poyar, that is to say couplets of 12 syllable lines. And it's going to be published later this year by HarperCollins in an illuminated edition. That is to say, it's going to have these beautiful pictorial.
That's a beautiful way to describe an illustrated book. Illumination sounds so much better.
I very strongly resist this word illustrated, because you know illustrated has become a kind of pejorative, as you know. I mean, especially in the arts, it's kind of a pejorative because it assigns images a lower role than the text. You know, it assumes that the image is a kind of subsidiary of the text. Whereas in this one, I don't think that's the case at all. I mean, you know, the artist I've been working with has produced really just beautiful images, and not very many, but a few. So, and then later in the year, I hope sometime around December, we are also planning to do a graphic novel of Junglenama, and perhaps even a board game, because you know these legends, our legends like the Bonbibi legend, exist in multiple iterations. It's not just a text. They exist also as plays, as jatras, as oral retellings, and so on. So, and I think there's something very important about that. The multiple iterations create a presence for this story in people's lives. In the Sundarban, the Bonbibi legend is it's not just a story. It's a charter of life. It's like a legal system. People live by those stories, you know. So I think it's very important going ahead into the future that our stories, the stories that we read, the stories that we read to our children, reflect, you know, the other beings that are in this world. You know, the beings such as forests, such as animals, and so on. And we have to find a way towards that. You remember that in the Great Derangement, one of the points that I make is that you know, in this moment of crisis, we have to find new forms of storytelling. We have to find new stories, new forms. And for me, Junglenama is one response to that. Most of all, because as I said also in The Great Derangement, I think we have to move away from our iconophobia, the iconophobia that's infected modern culture from the 19th century onwards, since the printed word, really. And the printed word came into being with Protestantism, which is also very iconophobic. I think we have to move away from that. We have to reclaim images. We have to think about the world in images.
So I think that's a wonderful point to end it, because we started with a moment of great fear for all of us who actually lived through those very anxious 4 or 5 hours last Wednesday. And perhaps it's people who tell us stories that help us, you know, navigate through that fear and make sense of nature at times like this. You have often been the prophet of what can lie ahead. I'm carefully avoiding the word doom, but you know, I think you cease to be a Cassandra and be more of a Nostradamus, and people will take your predictions a little more seriously now that, you know, we've had this flurry of storms around Bay of Bengal at least. So thank you, Amitav. We all look forward keenly to Junglenama, the illuminated book, the graphic novel, and indeed the board game. Keep those stories coming, and please stay safe during these very troubled times. Before I end, I just want to tell you that the Boipara has also, College Street has been badly affected by by the storm, and the Kolkata Literary Meet plans to start a fund to help some of these booksellers put put them back on their feet after the double whammy of COVID as well as Amphan. So I'm taking the liberty of using these last few minutes to notify all those who want to help these booksellers of College Street.
Malavika, I'd just like to end by saying, don't think of a storm as doom or something. Don't think of it as malign. I mean, the environment isn't malign or benign. The environment is supremely indifferent to us. You know, it does what it does, and a storm, it ends many things, but it also is a force of regeneration. After the storm passes, it regenerates, a lot of things regenerate. And that's how we have to think of our future, to find new ways. We have to generate new ways of being, in effect.
Thank you. That's a great way to end. Thank you for that. Some of us are still smarting under the blows of those winds. So yes, but what you said is right. I'd mentioned to you when we spoke that on Thursday morning the birds were silent, but on Friday they were chirping again, and the leaves were fluttering in a friendly way outside my window. So yes, nature does have many messages for us, even ones that, I mean, possibly all of them don't really mean to be messages, but we can learn a lot from nature. So thank you for being so instructive and for your time, and hope you stay safe, and thank you for spending this Sunday morning with us. Thanks.